Welcome to the briefing. This morning we're taking a deep dive into today's budget with some really stellar guests. But first, here's how today will pan out. At 10:45, Rishi will hold his red box aloft in the Chancellor's traditional budget photo op outside number 11. At midday, we'll bring you Prime Minister's questions live here on GB News. And at 12:40, the Chancellor will deliver his budget. We have special programming with all the reaction and analysis you can get your hands on at this big fiscal event. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor are then to head off to a brewery after the budget, potentially hinting at some good news around alcohol duty. Well, before all of that takes place, and to try and make sense of it all and go through some of the challenges and opportunities of this budget, I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Littlewood, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, who can join us now from College Green outside the Houses of Parliament. Mark, what are you expecting in this budget this afternoon?
Well, Tom, I don't think there's now going to be very many surprises. To the near fury of the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, it seems that nearly all of the budget has been drip-fed to one newspaper or another over recent days. Oftentimes the Chancellor holds something back to pull a rabbit out of the hat, as they call it, really giving proof to the thing, to the slogan that the budget is now really a conjuring trick rather than a fiscal event. We're pulling rabbits from hats rather than really adding up numbers properly on a spreadsheet. You might be right. I think that there's going to be a relaxation in beer duty or alcohol duty of some sort. But overall, what we can expect, Tom, is the Chancellor to spend a lot of money that, frankly, he doesn't have. We've seen £7 billion promised for local infrastructure projects. We've seen another £6 billion promised for the National Health Service. The public sector pay freeze looks like that's going to come to an end. Inflation's kicking in, so we might see public sector pay next year go up. Who knows, 2, 3, 4, 5%. I think we're going to see an awful lot of money spent. And if there is that little bit of good news on alcohol duty, I expect that to really be probably the only meaningful tax cut that the Chancellor brings forward. So if you're a low tax, balance the books and don't overspend kind of guy like I am, Tom, I think you're probably in for a disappointing day.
This is interesting. 37 billion is the number, I think, that has already been pledged. An extraordinary amount of money, given that we are in a time of unprecedented debt emerging from a crisis. I wonder, though, there have been some reports in the papers this morning that the Chancellor wants to build a bit of a war chest, something designed in case interest rates rise, something that could be deployed to ensure that no spending has to be cut back. However, if those interest rates stay low, that could be the manoeuvre, that could be the room for tax cuts coming into running up to the next election.
I think, Tom, that's right. Although I'm rather sceptical about the government borrowing money, certainly on the scale that it's been borrowing it in recent years, it is true to say that that borrowing is a lot easier when interest rates are low. If interest rates stay low, particularly with the present fiscal picture, the Chancellor has considerably more room for manoeuvre, either for yet more spending, because he can borrow at a low rate, or, as you rightly say, for tax cuts, because he can then still sustain the ongoing debt and deficit rather more easily. But I think that's a rather optimistic outlook, if I might say so, Tom. I think that interest rates are going to start to tick back up. I don't think there'll be a dramatic hike in the next 2, 3, 4 months, but over the next 2, 3, 4 years, one might presume that interest rates will return to normal, something around the 5% mark perhaps, rather than the 0% we've got at the moment. Doubly true if inflation kicks in. Interest rates are supposed to be the lever that is pulled to combat inflation. If we see inflation rising, interest rates surely will go up in lockstep with that. So if the Chancellor's hoping for prevailing low interest rates for this war chest of his, he may be very, very disappointed. I wish we had built up a war chest over the past 10 or 15 years, but it's actually been 20 years now, Tom, 20 years since any Chancellor last proposed a balanced budget to the Houses of Parliament just behind me here. 20 years since we last ran a surplus. Every year since, the government has spent more money than it has brought in tax, and that certainly is not going to change this afternoon.
It is an extraordinary statistic. 20 years, a generation where the UK has never balanced a single budget. Although I suppose the government would say that the current budget was balanced, just not infrastructure spend just a few years ago before the pandemic. I wonder now what the government can do to try and build confidence in terms of overseas investment and in terms of a public who, according to several opinion polls, now no longer see the Conservative Party as a low-tax party.
Yeah, well, I think the solution there, and I hope we'll hear a bit of it from the Chancellor today, although I'm not very hopeful in this year's budget in terms of what he's going to present for the next 12 months. But Tom, I hope we hear a bit more about the medium to longer term. Even a fiscal hawk like me can forgive the government for spending a lot of money at a time of crisis. Inevitably, in a pandemic, a bit like a war, the government leaves with a battering on its spreadsheet, with a huge hole in its public finances. And I'm not expecting the Chancellor to render that good overnight or today. But I would like to hear from him that over the next 2 or 3 years, he's determined to get back to balanced budgets, that's the trajectory he's headed in. And I think there would need to be some, if you like, statistical and numerical proof of that, Tom, not just the Chancellor saying that by instinct he's a balanced books kind of guy, by instinct he's a low tax kind of guy. We need to actually judge him by his actions. So I hope that we hear a lot from him about, even if we're not balancing the books now, is he aiming to do so by 2024, 2025, at some point in the relatively near term? Because if governments continue to spend money, hand over fist, that they don't really have, you're quite right, Tom, to imply that the markets get jittery. The markets realise that the position is unsustainable over the long run. So I think Rishi Sunak today needs to give some sort of pledge over the long run, and some sort of plausible pledge too, if we want Britain to remain as a very desirable place to do business and invest.
Certainly huge challenges ahead, potentially opportunities too. We will await with interest to see what happens in that budget, and if it is correct that just about everything has been said already. Hopefully there are some rabbits. That's what we hope for here on this news channel. But Mark Littlewood, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs, thank you so much for your insight and analysis this morning. A really interesting story. Well, let's get another perspective on the budget now. I'm delighted to be joined by the Labour MP Siobhan McDonough, who is also a member of the Treasury Select Committee. Welcome to the programme, Siobhan. What are you expecting the Chancellor to say later today?
Well, we've had a lot of it trailed in the press over the last few days, so we wonder how much there really is that is going to be a surprise. But, you know, the devil is always in the detail. You know, whether it's yesterday's announced public ending of the public pay freeze, which isn't quite what it seems, because perhaps those increases will be paid out of current budgets, so will actually mean cuts to services, whether the pay rise will actually be at inflation or above. All these things, as you know, Tom, as a seasoned watcher of these things, the devil is always in the detail.
And I suppose we won't really get that detail at the time of the announcement. It will be in the hours following the budget that will start to leak out. In previous years, actually, it's been a budget that potentially was well received on the day. As soon as we get into sort of the next day, the next few days, maybe even the next week, some people discover some less desirable parts of it. I wonder if this is a budget sort of mid-term where the government is willing to take more tough decisions. This seemed to be a government that runs in terms of looking at focus groups and opinion polls and always wanting to be popular. Do you think this is a Chancellor who's willing to take tough decisions when he needs to?
I mean, he may be prepared to take tough decisions, but don't think his next door neighbour at number 10 is really prepared to make tough decisions. So that's the problem. And we know that tension exists between Rishi Sunak being cautious on borrowing and the Prime Minister not quite so cautious and given to announcing schemes like a royal yacht or whatever. So we'll see. But I think you're absolutely right. It's a kind of thought that, you know, budgets that go down well on the day tend to unravel later. And what we're also seeing is re-announcements, you know, telling us about increase in spending, which have been announced perhaps 3, 4, maybe even 5 times previously. So those are all sorts of things to watch for. I'm just really worried that it's going to be a very long, cold winter for a lot of people in my constituency. I'm getting on the doorsteps a lot of concerns about increasing gas and electricity bills, people who go to work but have their income topped up by universal credit. The increase in the minimum wage to £9.50 is very welcome. But if that's combined with a £20 a week cut in your universal credit, you still come out worse off.
I've got to say, business rate cuts, opposing the national insurance increase, now proposing VAT cuts. The Labour Party's sounding more Thatcherite on economics these days than the Conservative Party. Have you just swapped clothes with each other? And the Chancellor now seems to be sort of this big state, high tax, high spend individual, and the Labour Party seeming potentially more fiscally rigorous.
As Gordon Brown would have told you during his period as Chancellor, there's no problem with fiscal rigour, but you do have to be fair in your decisions, and those decisions shouldn't hurt those who have least disproportionately, and that's what we're going to see with the national insurance increases. I think some carers agency, somebody who runs a carers agency that I was talking to was telling me that they thought the increase in national insurance alone would be an additional cost of a month's salary to one of their carers. So you do have to be very aware of who you're impacting.
No, it's a really thorny issue. All of these issues, huge challenges to come. Thank you so much for your analysis this morning, Siobhan. It's something that no doubt we will keep returning to. I am interested in this sort of modern day amalgamation of the parties. Are the two parties closer together? Or potentially on tax, is the Labour Party going a little bit further than the Conservative?
Can I tell you, the Labour is the party of business, and particularly small business.
Well, on that note, Siobhan McDonough, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing. No doubt we will explore those issues more and more as the days go on. And of course, I think Siobhan was absolutely right there. The devil will be in the detail. Well, let's listen to some of what the Chancellor might be saying later today. An economy of higher wages, higher skills, rising productivity, of strong public services, vibrant communities and safer streets. An economy fit for a new age of optimism. A new age of optimism. Those are the words that Chancellor Rishi Sunak will use later today to describe what he hopes will come of his budget. But how true will those words ring? Prices are rising, not least energy prices, as we approach winter. Skills gaps may mean shortages in some sectors. Inflation may eat away at our savings, and new taxes are set to bite our incomes. The British economy is weighted down by trillions in debt, the risk of real interest rate rises, inflation fears, and growth that has not yet taken us back to the position we were in back in February 2020. Not that replacement growth itself will be enough. Simply reverting back to the low growth trend of previous years will not be enough to pay down those gargantuan pandemic costs. Materially higher growth is needed to pay down our debt. A huge challenge for the Chancellor. But this is not all doom and gloom. While the challenges are vast, there is now the chance to rise to them. A chance for the Chancellor to instil confidence in the UK economy, put meaning behind his assertion that he really is a low-tax Tory. And let me be clear, while the economic outlook is tough compared to many other countries in the world, we're in a much stronger position. We have opportunities that Brexit has afforded us, both to liberalise our domestic economy and overseas to pivot our trade to the growth markets of the world. The strength of our vaccine rollout, too, has enabled Britain to have one of the most open and free societies anywhere in this part of the world. And that fact has reportedly led to an upgrading of growth expectations. There is good news out there. The challenge is to both sustain it and capitalise upon it. Real levelling up will not be achieved through simple cash transfers. Handouts don't work. Taking money away from one person to give to another is not levelling up, it's levelling down. Levelling up comes when the growth potential of left-behind areas is unlocked, allowing them to rise not by penalising areas of success, not by pulling others down, but allowing areas to lift up. Growth politics, not tax and spend. Well, the Chancellor has a lot to think about. Given the scale of the challenges, I can almost forgive him for his attire in number 11 last night. Look under the table here. Socks and sandals? Really? Not content with tanks on Labour's lawn, Rishi is now treading on Lib Dem toes. Socks and sandals. As with so much the Treasury is getting up to, if there hadn't been a pandemic, there really would be no excuse.